Another thing that zooarchaeology can teach us about is animal domestication. When certain animals were domesticated, the process, how they were domesticated. So, in order to understand this, we first have to kind of look at what is domestication. So, um, taking a wild animal and teaching it how to do certain things, and maybe taming it, and sort of adjusting it to live with humans is not animal domestication. That's training. So something like you see in the Tiger King and the Netflix show, where they're sort of habituating wild animals to people, is not domestication. Domestication is actually selection by humans for certain traits, in other words, breeding over time that produces different varieties of animals and even different species. That is domestication. So domestication involves a genetic selection and resulting in change over time and the production of new breeds. So, for example, dog domestication. Dogs either came from wolves or something like a wolf. Um, Modern dog populations, modern dog breeds are not at all like wolves in many respects. Genetically, there's some key differences, and there's also morphological differences, behavioral differences that are not just the product of training, but are actually genetically encoded in these animals. So new traits being selected and producing a new variety. This has been done not that long ago with foxes in the Soviet Union. And you're going to actually see a little bit of a video about this experiment that was done in the Soviet Union, the Boyalev experiment, where they actually selected for foxes that had a short flight distance, that were not afraid of humans. And by having these foxes breed, they actually produced some new varieties of foxes that were very different from their wild ancestors. Okay, typically the kinds of traits that we select for, that humans select for, are not the kinds of traits that would be helpful in the wild, right? So, for example, this was an article you can see here in Turkey about sheep, that one sheep fell off a cliff, the others followed, and then they all ended up falling off this cliff. Intelligence is something that we don't select for. In the wild, more intelligent animals survive better. Humans tend to select for animals that are less intelligent because they're easier to control. A lot of the things that we select for deal with control. Size is another one. Wild versions of animals tend to be larger because humans selected for smaller animals because, again, they're easier to control. Aggression is something that benefits you in the wild, but not something that humans would want, and so that is selected out as well. And typically when we think of sheep, we think of a very passive, gentle creature. That's domesticated sheep. Wild sheep are more aggressive, obviously. You think of a ram, or rams butting heads with each other, right? That's a really aggressive animal. This is a type of sheep that was produced in Turkey called a fat tail sheep. You can see that through human selection, this enormous tail now grows on these sheep, and this interferes with reproduction. So the only way that these animals can reproduce is if somebody holds the tail up while the other sheep mounts the female, while the male sheep mounts the female. Otherwise, they could not reproduce in the wild. So you could end up with new species that are completely dependent on humans. And so that is animal domestication. So how did it happen and why did it happen? Those are very important questions that archaeologists look at. Humans also domesticated plants as well and produced changes. And some cases, like with maize, they were very dramatic, and in other cases, like barley and wheat, they're a little less dramatic, right? So here you can see wild barley and domesticated barley, and if you had to guess which was which, I think most of you would guess that this was the wild barley and this was the domesticated barley. Why? Because of the larger seeds. In fact, humans selected for barley that produced larger seeds. Not only that, but humans selected for plants, barley plants that would produce more seeds per stalk, and also that would have a tough, what's known as a rachis. That's the connection of the seed to the stalk. That way, when you were going out and you were harvesting the barley seeds wouldn't fall to the ground as you were using your sickle to harvest them. Okay, so what does this mean archaeologically? Archaeologically, you can identify domesticated animals in various ways, and you can figure out when the earliest appearance of the domesticated cow or domesticated cattle or domesticated sheep appeared. One way to do this is through size reduction. So here what you can see is these are both cattle bones. This bone is equal to about that portion of that bone. Here you can see pig bones. Now this is an adult and this is an adult. Some people might say, well, this is smaller because it's juvenile, not an adult. But actually, it is an adult. And the way you can tell that, and you'll see this more clearly when you do your exercise, the way you can tell that is through, again, the growth plates, the fusion. These are some metatarsals, right? And a metapodial bone. And what you see here is this is a juvenile, this is an adult. In adulthood, these growth plates fuse. The end of the bone is completely fused to the shaft. You can see that this portion is already fused. This portion is not. But in adulthood, both ends are fused completely. Now, when you look back at this picture of these bones, what you see is that this is fused, this is fused. These are both adults. But you can see there's a real dramatic reduction in size. So wild cattle and domesticated cattle, wild pigs and a domesticated pig. So there's a real drop, sharp decline in size that archaeologists can measure, and this gives them an idea of when domestication occurred. So looking at this specific kind of bone and measurements of archaeological samples of this bone in the Middle East, for example, from sheep and goat, what you see is that there's pretty much the size is consistent, and then all of a sudden around 7000 BC you see a sharp drop in the size. This is the time at which these animals were domesticated, right? And so through the measurement of these bones, we can really identify when we have the earliest domestication of certain kinds of animals. And we could also look at the things that led up to this. That is, how they were using these animals and the incentive maybe to domesticate them. So here's an example of size reduction of cattle, which had the most dramatic size reduction in Europe. So this is what wild cattle would look like, and this is what the earliest domesticated cattle would look like. So here again, this is cattle. You can see wild, domesticated. These are pig bones. You can see that because the molars have erupted, they're both adults. This is wild pig, this is domesticated pig. Capra, these are goats. Wild goat, domesticated goat. Okay, so that's one of the ways that you can identify domesticated animal from size reduction. What's another way that you can do it? Well, this one doesn't really work well archaeologically. It's hard to identify. But in sheep, humans selected for more of the woolly hairs of a sheep and fewer of the long hairs that you can see in wild sheep, producing a sheep with a much more woolly coat, right? So here you can see the curly underwool and then the long coarse hair. Now, you're not necessarily going to get that archaeologically. Another thing you could look at, though, in goats in the Middle East are horns. Right? So these are wild goats. They have these long scimitar-shaped horns. A domesticated goat has a shorter, twisted corkscrew horn. Now, why would that be? Was that deliberately selected for? Maybe, maybe not. Obviously, wild goats would benefit from longer horns because it was good for protection and also competition for mates, whereas it would be a disadvantage when you're living close to humans, and so might have actually been kind of selected against. So you can identify domesticated goats in the Middle East in large part from the horn cores that are below or beneath the actual keratin horns, and they can tell you that goats had been domesticated at a certain point. Okay, you can also look at what are known as culling patterns. Culling, when you cull the herd, you can selectively kill off animals from different species and also different age groups and sexes. Right? You control the herd. Culling implies that humans are controlling a population. If you have evidence that there's culling going on, it shows that people are controlling those groups of animals. Now, what are they killing them off for? Well, imagine, let's say you want to cull a herd of sheep and goat, and you mainly want to use them for meat. Well, what would that look like archaeologically, and what would it look like if you graphed it out? Imagine if you had a population of sheep and goat. Right? When they're first born, you have the whole population there. Now, as you selectively kill off certain animals, the population is going to decrease percentage-wise. Now, if you're using them mainly for meat, you would want to kill them off, not when they're very young, like babies, because they wouldn't have a lot of meat on them. You'd want to kill them off or kill them at adulthood when they've reached their largest size and the meat is good quality. You wouldn't wait too late in their lifetime because the meat tends to kind of decline in terms of its quality. And so if you were going to graph this out, what you would see is either, and this is showing you the percentage of death, you kind of would have an increase of death around age 1 or a little bit after, and then kind of a trailing off. So here, looking at what's known as a survivorship curve, this curve is something that you can make for your cemetery data with human populations rather than animal populations. It's actually a very good kind of graph to use. I have instructions in the cemetery data cemetery project to show you how to do this. But what you can see here is that, up until age 1 or 1.5, there's not a sharp drop off in the sheep or the goats. Then people start to kill off some of these sheep and goats to use them as meat. But they obviously have to keep, at least 35% around in order to have the herd continue on into the next generation. So you'll have a sharp drop off here around adulthood and then a sort of a slow decline after that. So if they were using a population for meat, that's what the age profile would look like. And that's something that you would be able to figure out by looking at the animal bones and figuring out the age at which those animals died. Now imagine you're using them mainly for milk, right? So you really just want to maximize goat milk. Well, there are goats that are competing with you for the milk. Those are the babies. Now, of those babies, the ones that are the least useful are the males, because you only need a certain number of males to keep the herd going. The females, of course, are very useful. So if you were going to use them mainly for milk, it might look like something like this, where there's a sharp drop-off of very, very young animals, mostly males. You wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that archaeologically, but you'd have a sharp drop-off of very, very young animals, and then a very gradual decline after that, because you'd want to keep them around for milk for as long as they could produce milk. So that's what it would look like if you're using them mainly for milk. What about wool? Well, if you're using them for wool, there's really no reason to kill them off at any age at all. So the decline would be very gradual throughout the whole population. By the time they reach a certain age, they'll just kind of gonna die off. Now, if you put all of these together, this is what it would look like: wool and meat and milk. Right. So this is something that archaeologists have tested. They went to a site actually in Turkey called Gritila that dated from the time period of domestication, and they wanted to see, okay, what were people using these animals for as they were being domesticated? That is, what was the incentive to domesticate sheep and goat? Was it to have meat around? Was it to have milk? Or was it for their wool? So one of the things that they did is they collected the bones, and then they started to age the bones. They could tell juveniles, and this is something that you're going to do. Different bones fuse at different ages. So if you have a good number of bones, you're able to tell the approximate age of the animal. Once you reach an adult, though, another way to do it, you can see here, is through the teeth. So, very young animals are not going to have all their molars erupted. These are sheep or goat. You can see the kind of high cusps of the molars. And here you can see pigs, which have kind of rounded cusps. Now, here the molars have erupted. Here the molars have not erupted. This is a younger animal than this. Here you can see the molar just peeking out. This is an even younger animal. Now, what happens, though, when you have an animal that's past adulthood, where, all the bones have fused, all the teeth have erupted? How do you tell the difference between a 5-year-old sheep and a 6-year-old sheep? Well, the way you do this is by looking at the wear patterns on the teeth, because a 10-year-old sheep is going to have much worn-down molars than a 5-year-old sheep. Well, how do you tell what the molars of a 10-year-old sheep look like? The way they did this, is just as you would guess, someone had to go to flocks of sheep in places like Turkey, and they would ask the owner of the sheep, how old is this particular sheep? And the shepherds would know, okay, this, I know this one's about 10 years old. They would open the mouth of the sheep and make a diagram of the molars. And what you can see is then what you're able to do is, if you have archaeological samples of the molars of sheep or goat, you could then look at how worn down those molars are and figure out how old that sheep is. So when they did this for this site in Turkey, this is what they found. This is the survivorship curve. Now, in general, does this fit a milk, meat, or wool profile? If you guessed meat, you are correct. Right? About adulthood is when there's this sharp drop, not very early on. So what was the main incentive to domesticate sheep and goat in the Middle East? To have a ready supply of meat on hand for people. Then later, these other products like milk and wool became important. Okay, so culling patterns. If a herd was culled, that's also a good indication that people are beginning to domesticate or have domesticated those animals. Another piece of evidence that tells you that domestication is occurring, is beginning to happen, or has happened, is the shift in the kinds of animals that they're using. So, for example, in the Middle East, as you can see here, around the time that they start to domesticate certain animals like sheep, goat, cattle, and pig, what you see is that there's a shift, right? So, before the time of domestication, they were eating gazelle. They were also eating deer. They were eating sheep and goat, cattle, pig, and also foxes. And so here you can see the early period in the blue. They're mainly eating gazelle and fox with some of these other animals. But what you see is during the time of domestication is that there's a real shift away from those animals and towards the animals that eventually become domesticated: sheep and goat, cattle, and pig. Right? Now, why were those animals domesticated and not other animals? That's a really good question. The animals in the Middle East that were domesticated are sheep, goat, cattle, and pigs, donkeys, horses, and camels later on. The things that these animals share is that they're herbivores, for the most part, and they're herd animals. The animals that are very hard to domesticate are animals that are not herd animals, like white-tailed deer, or tigers, or lions. Those animals also are carnivores. So carnivores that are solitary are animals that are very difficult to domesticate because they don't want to be in large groups, and it's very difficult to feed them. If you saw that show, Tiger King on Netflix again, if you watched it, they profile this exotic tiger breeder who struggles to feed these animals. He has something like, at one point, I can't remember how many tigers, but it's quite a number, maybe 100 or something. And it was extremely expensive to feed these animals. In fact, they were dumpster diving at Walmart at one point to try and feed these animals. So that's why a tiger is just not a very suitable animal to domesticate. It could kill you. It eats meat. It's a solitary animal. Very difficult. Sheep, goat, cattle, and pig, they're herd animals that eat grass. Very cheap. I mean, they're not competing with you for food. You don't have to do anything to feed them except take them outside and let them eat grass. They're not going to kill you, right? A goat's not going to kill you for food or try and eat you. And they like to be in large groups. So they're absolutely perfect for domestication. So that's why those kinds of animals were domesticated, and why other animals were not domesticated. So of these animals, you can see, gazelle are kind of skittish. They're hard to control. Deer, also a little bit, harder to control. Foxes are not herd animals. They are also are carnivores. So the people in the Middle East shifted away from those animals, and they shifted towards the animals that could be domesticated. Okay, so that's another piece of evidence that domestication is occurring. Another piece would be, what if you're digging in an archaeological site, and at this archaeological site you see sheep bones, cattle bones, and you know that naturally in this area those animals don't exist. Well, then you would say that people probably brought them to that site, and that again is evidence that they have domesticated these animals or are beginning to do that. Cultural evidence. We talked about Coster and domesticated dogs, right? So one piece of evidence for domestication is this kind of cultural evidence, right? Burial, where you're treating the animals differently. You're not just sort of butchering them up, but maybe you have reverence for certain animals. Maybe there's artwork showing the use of these animals, like this milking scene from Knossos, or this one from Mesopotamia. Another good piece of evidence is sometimes the wear and tear on the bones. These are, again, the lower limbs of animals. And what you see is this is a pretty normal bone. But over here, you can see lots of scar tissue forming on this part of the bone. And the reason why that would be is from heavy labor that humans are putting on these animals. In nature, you would never see animals with this kind of labor damage on their bone. This is from humans using these animals for certain jobs. That again would be evidence of domestication. So overall, size of the animal decreasing over time, the shape of the horn, culling patterns, the different kinds of species used over time, animals existing outside their natural habitats, cultural evidence like artwork, and also biological evidence on the skeletal structure itself, showing, let's say, heavy labor or heavy work, would all be pieces of evidence that you could use to say that humans were in the process of domesticating or had domesticated animals.